Welcome back to the discussion of spatial computing. Today we are going to interview Professor Michael Goodchild, the foremost geographic information scientist in the world. He has shaped the field in many ways, and a lot of us have learned about a range of topics from him. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Michael Goodchild.
Hello. Thank you.
Hello.
Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So Professor Goodchild, thank you for taking the time to share your experiences and advice with the students in Spatial Computing MOOC. We wanted to start with a very simple question. I noticed that your undergraduate major was physics. So how did you come to geographic information science and spatial computing from physics?
Well, there were really two steps. The first one was from physics to geography, which was driven by, I had a personal interest in exploring caves, and I wanted to do research on caves. So I found myself in a geography department, and then inevitably computers were just starting to appear. People were starting to automate cartography. And so by the late 1960s, it was pretty clear to me that I was going to have to develop as an expert in computing and geography. And eventually that crystallized around GIS. And that was probably about 1972. I think I was fully committed to GIS.
Yeah, wonderful. And one of the seminal contributions you made was to lead this National Center for Geographic Information and Analysis, which in some sense gelled the community. It brought a lot of people together and created some common understanding. So would you share with us the history of NCGIA and its significance in current space?
Sure. Well, in the mid-1980s, a program officer in the National Science Foundation saw an opportunity to push for a national center in GIS. And there was a lot of discussion about what it might do, what its research topics might be, and what its title might be. But eventually by 1988, National Science Foundation was ready to make an award, and it came to us at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with the University of Buffalo and the University of Maine as partners. And it became a very, I think, influential focus for research, fundamental research in spatial computing and geospatial technologies.
So wonderful. And you have championed many topics, Professor Goodchild, one of which will be discussed in this course, and that is volunteered geographic information, or VGI.
Yeah.
And you were one of the earliest ones, at least in academia, to start championing that topic and start changing the attitudes about VGI. So it will be great to hear from you what VGI is and why do you think it's exciting for spatial computing in general?
Well, I think like many ideas, it's matured through time. And when I first started writing about it and talking about it in 2006, I saw it as a very interesting alternative to how geographic information was normally produced. Because in the past, most maps in the world and most geographic information had been created by government agencies and by large companies. And here all of a sudden was the possibility that individual citizens might start producing geographic information. And so that was the initial excitement. And I think after that came a second round of excitement when we realized that the effects of VGI were going to be much more profound than simply another way of producing the same information. That instead people were starting to produce new kinds of information and to have a pretty fundamental influence on the whole world of GI science. And I identify that as what has been called neo-geography, or, I mean, essentially it's what happens when the average citizen gets engaged, not only in the consumption of geographic information, but also in its production. And so we've seen some very interesting effects over the last 10 years as this whole area has gained momentum.
Wonderful. Although, naively one would think that citizens are not always well trained in many details of GIS. They may not know all the coordinate system, or they are not trained with the instrument. So naively one would think maybe the data quality may suffer if you engage all the citizens in collecting data. Is that the case?
Yes, and there are other effects as well, such as malicious activity. With many of these Web 2.0 projects, it's possible for people to have a malicious effect by contributing data which they know full well to be false. We have various ways now of improving what gets accepted and what gets queried and what gets rejected. And so, but I'd also add that in the past, while we think of everyone who works for a government agency in the mapping business as necessarily an expert, that's not always true. And it's possible for people in very responsible positions to make very simple mistakes, which are the same kinds of mistakes an average citizen would make. So I think the whole idea that there are experts and there are amateurs, and there's a clear distinction between them, I think that has been really challenged over the past few years.
Wonderful.
So I'm generally very optimistic about the quality issue.
But certainly VGI has momentum. The national agencies are looking at that data sets, and even in industry, Google seems to now employ a lot of volunteers to...
Absolutely, and as does pretty much every company. They may be involving citizens in sort of a hybrid arrangement where the citizens come up with corrections or updates that are simply too expensive for the agency or the company to make by itself. And so that provides a very, very useful way of maintaining geographic information.
Wonderful. Now, another project, I wanted to briefly catch up on was the Alexandria project. In mid-90s, when the internet was just starting, there were all these digital library projects, and Alexandria, in some sense, championed the geospatial case, and possibly may have been the precursor to Google Earth and other web-based GIS services. So it will be nice to hear from you what was the motivation for Alexandria and what were the main impacts.
Well, it was very simple. Originally, the idea was that a map library was a very traditional concept. People would go to map libraries, pull maps out of the drawers, and make use of them for various purposes. And we thought it would make a lot more sense for the map library to be on the web, so that you wouldn't have to physically go to the map library, just as you wouldn't have to go physically to a library to retrieve a book these days. And so we saw doing for maps what other projects were doing for books and other kinds of materials. And that's really how it got started, as an effort to put a map library, the services of a map library, on the web so that anyone could access from anywhere.
Wonderful. And what kind of projects are you working on nowadays, Professor Goodchild?
Well, I'm retired, and I'm trying to minimize my activities, but of course it takes time. I still have students at UCSB. I only retired 2 years ago. I'm still involved in book projects and various research projects of various kinds. I'm involved in a project called CyberGIS, which is about bringing high-performance computing into the arena of GIS. We've often thought that there are massive computing resources out there, and it would be good to enlist them in support of GIS activities. And that's essentially what CyberGIS is about. It's about using cyber infrastructure to solve geospatial problems. So that's one I'm involved in. Another one I'm involved in is concerned with uncertainty and with how to visualize uncertainty. We know that all geographic information is uncertain to some degree. And yet, very often when we present it, it's presented as if it were certain. And so we're trying to find ways of making it easy for people to understand the essential uncertainty that's present in geographic information.
Wonderful. Very, very critical topics, given in climate change, uncertainty is becoming a very, very major issue. Wonderful. So the last question, looking next few years ahead, what do you see is the future of GIS and spatial computing? What are the major trends and directions?
Right. So let me just mention two, because I think there are a lot of them, but I think two would be a good start. First, this idea of engaging the citizen with geographic information. I mentioned that it's having profound effects, and I think those effects have still to play themselves out. And when we talk about VGI, we usually think of a project like OpenStreetMap, where people are helping to create a map of the world by using their own GPS or their own cell phone or what have you. But that's using people to produce something that has been traditionally part of our lives. And what is really different is when you say, what are people really good at? What kinds of geographic information do they really harbor in their heads? And it's not information about latitude and longitude. It's information about places. And so I'm trying to explore the whole possibility of developing technology not around coordinates and around space, but around named places, features on the Earth's surface. People have huge repositories of information about places. Now, you know that Seattle is known as a rainy place.
Right.
That piece of knowledge doesn't fit within any GIS. And yet that sort of knowledge is enormously valuable, and we have huge resources of that knowledge in the human mind. So I'm interested in exploring how we can release that knowledge and share it.
Wonderful.
So that's one.
Great.
The second one is that we sometimes refer to GIS technology as the 83%,
I see.
the 17, go the other way, the 17% technology. Because the average human spends only 17% of their lives outdoors and 83% of their lives indoors. And so I'm very interested in the possibility of an indoor version of GIS.
Great.
As GIS helps you navigate outdoors, I think it should also help us navigate indoors. Believe it or not, there are actually people in this world who get lost in their own homes. All of us get lost in large shopping centers, in complex airports, and yet our GIS technology doesn't work there and doesn't give us very effective help.
Wonderful.
So I think one very definite growth direction is indoor GIS, geared towards the 83% of our time that we spend indoors, rather than the 17% we spend outdoors.
Wonderful. These are really, really promising directions. To wrap up the interview, I just wanted to ask, are there any parting thoughts for this broad audience of 16,000 students on MOOC? In what way can they participate, and what can they do for spatial computing in near future?
Well, I think space has really not been part of computing in the past. When computers started, they were machines for making calculations. They were machines for decrypting messages. They weren't machines for maps. And when I first encountered GIS and maps, I wondered why you would ever want to put a map in a computer. It seemed like a strange idea at the time. This is the late 1960s. Today we've begun, but we've only just begun. And the whole potential of this technology is still largely untapped. We talk about spatially enabling society. And we've done that to some extent, but not anywhere near to the extent that we will in the future. We will have far more information, I think, in the future about where things are. And we will ask many more questions about where. Today, we can ask questions perhaps about how or why, but the where question is still largely elusive.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Goodchild, for taking out the time from your busy schedule and sharing a few minutes with our Spatial Computing MOOC.
Great.
And hopefully through readings and other ways, most students will come to know more about your work and participate, and probably even see the book, GI Science book, the popular book you have co-authored.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Great. So in this interview, we had a very long-term perspective starting 60s to now, how GI science has evolved and how spatial computing has evolved, where it is going. Hopefully we'll see you soon in interviews with other prominent people in the field to get another perspective on the topics we have covered. Thank you.